Our power grid is facing unprecedented challenges driven by the need to decarbonize, driven by digital technologies, and a new role in which the customer is engaged with the electron like never before. Thinking about that and preparing for that requires a new, flexible mindset we haven't needed in the past.
Your trusted source for information on the energy transition. This is the Insider's Guide to Energy podcast. Welcome to another edition of the Insider's Guide to Energy. I'm your host, Chris Sass, and with me today is Peter Kelly-Detwiler. Peter, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Chris.
We're happy to have you on the show. I always like to start our segments with a little background of who our guest is so our audience knows who we're talking to today.
Sure. I've been in power markets and in electricity for over 30 years, and I was involved in retail power back in 1997 when that started with New Energy Ventures, which then got bought by AES, which got bought by Constellation. And ultimately, I ended up heading up their demand response group, where we paid customers not to consume electricity during periods of peak demand. We got that to about 1,700 megawatts. I eventually took severance when we got bought yet again, another golf shirt added to my portfolio. And then I just started researching and writing for Forbes and others. And for the last 12 years or so, I've been in full-on research and communications mode. I read 40 newsletters a day and try and stay up on top of everything having to do with the electron.
Well, it seems like it's a pretty busy place to be. There's quite a bit being published. I think I get offers to subscribe to newsletters almost every day. How do you pick and choose? What are the voices that you want to follow? Who are the voices that are making sense today?
Well, certainly, Canary Media always has really great contextualized articles, and their stable of writers has been at it for a long time. Jeff St. John, for example, 12 or 13 or probably 15 years now at Green Tech Media. Some of the other ones really good there too. Trellis, the Green Biz group that's now writing under Trellis, they've got some really wonderful content there. And then Hydrogen Insights over, I think they're from Europe, Electrive that comes into my mailbox at like 3 in the morning. So I try and cover all the different sectors: batteries, EVs, hydrogen, renewables, policy. Utility Dive has wonderful articles. Herman Trabisch and others write there really, really well. So it's a smattering, and I actually have a spreadsheet with about 40 of them on there, and I rate them all with the URLs and the subscription links. And if people want it, just email me or reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I'll share my reading resource list.
All right, so you're tracking a lot that's what's going on. You've definitely fallen the utility space. What are some of the things that we should be talking about today? What are some of the trends that you're seeing that you think would be interesting for our audience?
Yeah, I think there's two major ones. On the bulk power side, you've got this whole issue where demand is starting to ramp up again because of AI and beneficial electrification. And there's long interconnection queues, multi-year delays in getting transformers, and we're facing a changing and evolving power grid because of all the renewables which have their variable output. So resource adequacy, how do we grow the grid and keep the lights on, is a big one. And then at the same time, you're seeing all this change happening on the low voltage distribution grid, which will be, I believe, the front lines of a lot of this change. Certainly from the perspective of the customer, that's where it's going to be all visible, whether it's electric vehicles or heat pumps. And as we've seen in multiple storms recently, just keeping the infrastructure going. I mean, what happened in Texas this month was incredibly disturbing to a lot of people in terms of how long the outages lasted. So a lot more stress and change on the distribution system as well. So bulk power, resource adequacy, distribution system, how do we evolve that, make it smarter, make it more resilient?
Okay, so you talked about to the left and the right hand. You talked about the kind of the distribution grid, and then we talked about the utility scale. Where are we focused today, or where do we need to focus? Is there a chicken and egg problem? So the consumers, you said, are going to be impacted most from the low voltage distribution. We just talked about outages and infrastructure. You also mentioned your opening AI and demand going up. Where do we need to be focused right now?
Yeah, let's focus on the low voltage distribution grid, because we could talk for hours about this. I mean, I teach a 7-hour course on the fundamentals of the grid, and even there we don't cover it all. So, but let's talk about what's happening in terms of the transformation of our relationship as customers with electricity. Okay, so For the first time now we have electrification of transportation. I have an electric vehicle. I drive it almost every single day, and I plug it in with my 120 voltage. But most people have, the faster 240 voltage, and then there's 400 kW chargers. I don't know if you just saw that. What was it? Mercedes-Benz and Starbucks are planning on putting in 100 charging locations at different Starbucks along I-5 on the West Coast between Canada and Mexico, and they're going to be 400 kilowatt chargers. A 400 kW charger, 400 kW is larger than a really decent-sized grocery store. So now you've got, thousands and thousands of EVs. The slowdown in sales notwithstanding, that's probably temporary. It's a better tech at the end of the day, and batteries are getting better. So you're going to see this huge influx of transportation being dominated by the electron. And then also space heating, you're going to see more and more air conditioning that's ground source and air source heat pumps and so on. So now you start to see all these stresses on the distribution grid, which, by the way, is right now operates at around 41 to 43% of its capacity, total max capacity. The utilization factor is around 41 to 43%. I like to say, if we ran our airlines that way, on Thanksgiving, everybody could show up the day before Thanksgiving, come up to the counter, get a ticket guaranteed for maybe under $300, fly anywhere in the U.S., and then the rest of the year, we'd all be able to stretch out because the planes would be like 41, 42, 43% full. Now, as we start to electrify transportation, these other end uses, plus bring in data centers and everything else, what's going to happen is our grid, which has traditionally in the last decade or so only grown at about 1%, sometimes even less. A whole lot of states grew negative last year. They're going to start to see localized stresses depending upon where these EV chargers are, depending upon where the data centers are, etc. And so you have, for example, a study that the PUC in California commissioned that said if we see a full electrification scenario by 2035, we might have to spend $50 billion to upgrade our infrastructure, mostly transformers and feeder lines, because they won't be able to handle the loads and especially the thermal stresses. Things overheat when they tend to be overutilized. And so we're going to have to think about how to manage the charging, manage these other end uses. And of course, we're integrating all kinds of batteries, and EVs are batteries on wheels. So what we're going to have to do real soon, Chris, is take a look at this patchwork and start to organize it way better than we are now, which means we're going to have to infuse it with a lot of artificial intelligence and know the what. What's that thing? What's the device? Is it a battery? Is it an EV? Is it a water heater that can respond? Where is it located? Overlaying on the utility grid and knowing where the transformers are reaching their thermal limits. What is it doing? What can it do? How much can it do? For how long? And what's that worth to society?
There's software companies out there doing that today, right? We had the 1.0 version of smart meters, and that kind of was an incremental step. Now we've got pretty smart technology going down. Your appliances are connected to the internet. So from a consumer's point of view, isn't software already being put in place to do what you're describing, to help manage what we have?
At some level, yes. So I think about it sort of as a spoken hub right now, where there's specific vendors like STEM with batteries behind the meter and commercial, Connect with a whole bunch of different devices, Tesla with its power walls and so on. And they're all doing this in sort of one-off or building virtual power plants. But what we're not doing is looking at the entire grid and saying, well, what's the avoided cost of all this infrastructure replacement? And some of it's only 5 or 10 hours a year where it's really stressed. So what's the value of not consuming electricity right now or injecting power back into the grid at this sort of macro over level, but then going down into the micro and saying, where are these avoided costs? A really good poster child use case example for that is the Brooklyn Queens Demand Management Project, where in Brooklyn and Queens, a couple of years ago, a lot of yuppies were moving into that area, and the peak demand was pushing towards the evening, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night. And Consolidated Edison said, we're going to have to put in a new substation and feeder lines worth $1.2 billion, unless we invest in the alternatives. So they put in about $117 million worth of voltage management, demand response, fuel cells, efficient lighting, and batteries, and essentially avoided the need to build that substation by at least 10 years. So essentially you can look at the avoided costs of these build outs that you otherwise would build and say, well, if we change our behavior and incentivize people to do X and stream prices to devices, then we could actually create a more efficient grid and not have to build so quickly. And we could actually get from, say, 43, 42% up to maybe 46, 47, 48% capacity utilization. So yes, there are green shoots right now. Individual companies are doing this. And no, holistically, at a macro level, the utilities aren't yet making the fundamental IT platform investments and creating those capabilities to interact with the vendors. And I should also add, there's a group that I advise called Competitive Utility Solutions, and it's a nonprofit. And we've been talking to different state utilities commissioners. The idea, do like what Australia and Germany have done. Create a universal registry so that every single device that interacts with the grid has its own unique ID, like we have social security numbers. And you would know who the manufacturer is, what the thing is, what it can do, and so on. That would allow for really efficient aggregations. And Chris, one of the critical things is if CAISO, for example, or New York ISO calls for a DR event, where are the DR devices? They're all in the local distribution grid. The local distribution grid often doesn't have visibility into what's happening. And so the situational awareness piece of this whole thing is missing because right now it's vendors doing this thing independently and individually, and there's not a landscape that allows everyone to see what they need to see when they need to see it, that's permission-based, it protects privacy, and creates something that would build a lot more efficiency into future transactions.
All right. Well, the good news is I think that there are a number of folks working towards this. I think it's a work in progress, and I've seen a number of software vendors and other folks that have that vision. I guess what I would then say is, how does this change? I mean, when you're talking, you're kind of implying the big utility and things like that. But with microgrids and a distributed architecture, how much is transformative in the architecture along with the software?
Well, so the first thing, yes, you need the microgrid architectures, but big picture, you got to figure out. Let's start with utility in the control room. Right now, the control room operator sees what's going on in SCADA, and there may be hundreds of devices, but it's still manageable. Now, when you get into this future state with all these, ultimately, if it's PG&E, for example, with 5 million meters, you could have 20 million devices out there. And by the way, if you have got you've got vendors doing this, each state can't adopt what they're doing now. New York has its own nomenclature, and California has its own taxonomies, right? So in a future state, you have to build some kind of efficiencies that will make that happen. Now, think about the architecture that needs to take place. You have to understand latency, first of all. How fast do you need the data? You don't need the meter data right away, but you certainly need the data from whatever that vehicle to grid charger is, whether it's the telematics in the vehicle or the charging infrastructure itself, or the battery in somebody's garage or in a commercial building basement. Where are the decisions made? They can't be made in the control room. If this is local situation based because there's a voltage issue or a frequency issue or some kind of thermal constraint right now affecting a transformer, that has to be an edge decision. But that information, ultimately, we have to figure out how to aggregate it, where it's aggregated, what flows back to the control room, what they see, what they don't see, so that we don't overload those operators in the control room, because they can only take in so much data. I had a chance to chat with the industrial psychologist from ERCOT years ago, who basically explained to me how they were building these maps so that the control room operators saw only what they needed to see and weren't overloaded and became paralyzed by the data. So the fundamental architecture of how we pull this stuff back and where we aggregate it and what the control room operator sees and what they don't need to see, that's something that still hasn't been fully developed yet. And yes, there are individual software operators doing pieces of this, but building out a holistic vision, that's not there yet.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. I mean, I see in your opening comments you talked about AI. I've seen vendors that have like NVIDIA down at the meter, built into their cards, helping decide what information gets acted upon locally and then aggregating this stuff and moving it upstream. So who ultimately becomes responsible? Who owns that? You mentioned that Texas doesn't want to be a part of the federal system. So how do you get everyone to play nice in the sandbox? I mean, we did it in telecom. We've done it in networking. How do we do it in energy?
Well, I think, at the end of the day, a lot of this does boil down to some kind of federal overlay. And Texas is going to be its own thing because they've said they're going to be. So there, for example, with FERC Order 2222 that came out in September of 2020, one of the things in 2222, it said, thou shalt, grid operators, come up with operating models so that aggregated devices over 100 kW will be treated like any other device in the grid. One of the things that it also said was you need to figure out the communications protocols and the ways of interacting between the grid operators and the distribution grids and the vendors. And also regulators need to see it as well, right? And retailers. So it's the protocols need to be universalized to make this thing more efficient. Among other things, if you think about it, Chris, if vendor A goes out of business or you want to integrate, ultimately over time we're going to see consolidation. I can tell you from experience, when at Constellation we bought CPower, it was a major pain because all of their taxonomy was different than ours. And even when we were doing demand response with different ISOs, take noon to 1 o'clock. Some of the ISOs had hour ending 13, others had hour ending 12. At the end of the day, this has to be somebody like NIST, some national level entity saying we need to standardize around these things and we need to do it sooner rather than later. Otherwise, we're going to create a Tower of Babel that's going to defy the ability to scale this and build the future efficiencies in. And then Texas is going to be going and doing its own thing because it always does.
Where are we on the journey? You also talked about storage and all the new elements getting added in. So let's assume that standards body is going to come because it probably needs to, and there's going to be some sort of layer that you can help manage and control the number of assets or Internet of Things and devices out there. What about the other technologies, the renewable technologies? How are they playing in and where are they in this equation?
Well, I think the thing that's fascinating about renewables is, and storage as well, is the post-COVID supply chain blip notwithstanding, we're seeing exactly what we expect to see, which is a learning curve continuing to play out. That whole concept of Wright's law where, back in the 1910s or whatever, Theodore Wright, the economist, looked and said, every time airframe production doubles globally, the cost of labor falls 10 to 15%. Well, nowadays, the experience curve of Wright's law is every time battery production doubles globally or solar panels, the costs fall by roughly 20 to 25, even 28%. There's a couple things going on there. One is efficiency of manufacturing and supply chain. But the other one, which has to do all about artificial intelligence and the dedication of machine learning to the way we make stuff. So a couple years ago when I wrote my book, The Energy Switch, I had a chance to go to Lawrence Berkeley Labs and see a supercomputer named Corey. And she could do 14 petaflops, which is quadrillion calculations per second. And one of the jobs she had to do, besides modeling the Big Bang Theory and stuff like that, was to help find better battery chemistries or better solar chemistries that would help us convert photons into electrons more efficiently. And so one of the chemistries with batteries helped them drive down the cost and create a more efficient cell. And I thought Corey was cool. She was in a big cavern, all these Cray computers wired together. But I walked into the next room, which is an empty concrete cavern, and said, what's going to be in here? And they said, you know how fast chips are moving, right? And I said, yeah. They said, well, Corey's going to be obsoleted within a few years. And sure enough, now she is. Now there's Perlmutter. Perlmutter does like 64 quadrillion calculations per second. And Corey used 3.5 megawatts. Perlmutter uses 2.5 megawatts. And Perlmutter is specifically designed for material science to make better things. So whether it could be better transmission lines, whether it's going to be better battery chemistries, so on and so forth, right? Perovskites, for example, figuring out perovskites, which are a cheaper way to make solar panels. Those sorts of material science inquisitions get faster and faster. Oh, and the other thing, I was talking to a guy on the airplane about this, and it turns out he was a nuclear physicist, and so he looked at me pityingly and said, yeah, but it takes years to synthesize these molecules, these theoretical compounds, once you've defined what they are, created the cookbook, the recipe. I said, yeah, but I just found out from a conversation with LBL, they're now enlisting robots, and robots can do the synthesis 24/7. And they also record all their data, even their failures. And so now there's more raw material for us to interrogate, to accelerate the process of material science. And at the end of the day, what's the grid? It's physical assets, generation, wires, poles. It's physics and it's chemistry. So taking raw horsepower and accelerating that horsepower and yoking it to the human mind is guaranteed to accelerate the process of technology and make better stuff, if you will, to make a more efficient and more cost-effective future grid.
Wow, that was a lot. So your hypothesis is that better computing and robotics helps accelerate it and getting us through the energy transition. Is that a Cliff Note version of what you just told me?
Yeah, hashtag can't not happen. It's inevitable. Because there's so much money there's so much money to be made in the efficiencies around that, plus the benefits for society in avoiding carbon and dealing with climate change. So it's inevitable that the technological advances will continue.
So we have technology driving, we've got robotics, we have AI, but those are also the same elements driving the demand for more energy. Which wins the race?
A really good question. And certainly one of the things that one finds, the longer ones in this game, is that prediction is a fool's errand. Almost nobody a year ago or a year and a half ago foresaw how much AI-driven data centers right now are in the pipeline. It's almost, I looked yesterday at a report from Cushman Wakefield from January of this year. It's like across the globe, 43,000 megawatts of data centers are in pipeline development right now. That exceeds what's in the data centers built space already. It's huge. And so, yes, I think there are going to be a lot of future demands on the grid, especially because electricity then gets used for hydrogen. We already talked about transportation and so on. The electron it's a more elegant energy deliverer, if you will, than a lot of other fuels are. And so it certainly has its place, and I think will grow as a consequence. And because we're really building out a parallel central nervous system to our own on the planet, sensors would be the nerves, and just like we have an electrical system, we're putting fiber cables all over the planet, submarine cables. That takes a lot of energy. And so who wins that thing? I think it's still not clear. But what is obvious is that atmospheric chemistry really doesn't care about what we think. It's going to do what it's going to do. And so ultimately we get forced into making a cleaner grid and a cleaner energy economy win, because the costs, if we don't do it, are likely to be quite considerable in terms of economic damage and human suffering.
So how do we get there? Is the ratepayer going to be needing to pay more to get us through this transition, or is it built in? Like you said, if I haven't painted and suddenly I have wood rot, I got to rip out the wood and do more construction than having painted along the way. So for your house analogy, what do they do then? How do they get this infrastructure fixed?
Well, you look at places like FPL where they went and put in all these concrete poles and communicated to people, hey, we're going to be outside your house. We're going to be there for 3 days. And, the infrastructure is bigger, too. Like it's at FPNL, I was reading some of this anecdotally because I was doing work for a client on power poles. And people complain because it's bigger. It's a little bit uglier than wooden poles. But boy, is it capable of responding to a Cat 2 or 3 hurricane? Yeah, because it's a big concrete pole. That's an expenditure. And, the other thing, climate is changing. And so a lot of utilities are now saying, look, we need to harden our infrastructure in ways we didn't have to do. PSEG in New Jersey, we have to essentially elevate our transformers and a lot of our infrastructure along the coast because sea level rise. So there are those costs. So yes, the answer is we're probably going to end up having to pay a lot more for distribution costs than we have now. People look at California, Chris, and they go, well, how come rates are so high? Well, one of the reasons is because the utilities, especially PG&E, are having to spend billions of dollars to protect against wildfires. That's a phenomenon they didn't have to deal with at nearly the same scale 20 or 30 years ago. I highly recommend the book California Burning by Catherine Blunt, the Wall Street Journal reporter, if you want to get a sense of.
Yeah, Catherine's been on the program. She's a friend of the program.
Oh, yeah.
She
Yeah.
been on the show talking about that.
Okay, good.
And talking about
Yeah.
the aging infrastructure there. I mean, in California, there's a different situation because you can also use microgrids to help reduce the risk and all. But I guess the one inconsistency I hear is you mentioned in your opening remarks how long it takes to get transformers and the supply chain for a lot of these things. So if everybody decided today to upgrade infrastructure, to fix the infrastructure, it wouldn't happen today because I don't think the supply chain is in place. Do we manufacture and have enough of the pieces onshore or near shore or somewhere to get the pieces we need to do what you're talking about?
No, let's take one example. So you have a certain grain steel for transformers. And even before the AI deluge, AI data center deluge now, which is just incredible, even before that, the administration and the Economic Council was looking at transformers. And Wood Mackenzie has a report that says, it takes now years to get a transformer. We manufacture 20% domestically of the transformer amount that we need in this country. It's a lot imported from Japan and places like that, right? China, Japan, etc. And so that's the other thing. We've offshored so much of our industry that we're reliant on these international supply chains, and we've made ourselves vulnerable as a consequence because everybody's clamoring for this stuff. I was just looking for a client at data center construction around the world. Yes, Northern Virginia is the largest, but Mumbai's growing, and places I'd never even heard of as cities are putting in gigawatts worth of data centers. They're all going to need transformers. So we're stuck in a global world, and a lot of the things we need, we're not going to be able to get because we're not the only place faced with these same sorts of problems.
Well, we've gone all over the place in our conversation today. I guess, how do we pull this together as we come to the last couple minutes of our conversation? Pull this together for us. What's your take of what you're giving us, and what do we do with the information I just received?
Sure. So I think if you look at this in terms of the context of the 3 Ds, digitalization, decentralization, and decarbonization, they're all happening. The digitalization because of IT and AI and so on, and decentralization because all this technology is now showing up at our doorsteps, whether it's EVs, batteries, solar panels, etc. And decarbonization, well, that's a pretty obvious one for most people. Ideologically, depends where you sit, but the science is the science. So the grid sits at a really critical juncture right now where we're facing a lot of really challenging decisions within the context of a high level of uncertainty. So one of the things to do is to figure out what are the potential scenarios we might be facing over the next 5 or 10 years. Linear growth isn't going to be what we're going to face. We just know that now. So now you have to start planning for optionality and uncertainty in ways you never did before, which is really scenario planning. And you have to start to say, well, what if we arc towards this outcome instead of that one? What are the things we need to have in place? And now you say to yourself, okay, in the scenario planning, what are the milestones that tell us we're arcing towards this outcome rather than that one? And what are the pre-established scenarios we have to start making investments in? And so it's not going to be an easy task. And as we know, just when we think we know something, things change. Whether it's EV sales or whatever we project, it ends up being wrong. That's just the reality of things recently. And our S-curve for adoption and so on, they tend to be steep and surprise us. But there are some knowns. And the knowns are that the change is accelerating faster than it ever has. And the customer's getting involved in ways they never have before. And that the grid is digitalizing. So utilities, for example, have to hire a whole new breed of cat who's way more IT savvy, and they also have to break down their vertical silos and start to communicate horizontally with each other. They have to integrate more vendors into their activities. It really, what requires is a much more versatile mindset, like what HECO's kind of done in Hawaii with the PUC there, which is try and plan for a future state that's very uncertain, that involves a lot of dynamism at the grid edge within the context of the mandate to decarbonize. Not easy, but flexibility is a watchword, and certainly scenario planning is absolutely critical now.
Cool. I think we've covered a lot. I appreciate you summarizing it together. I'm looking forward to the journey ahead. I think it's going to be a bumpy road before it gets better, but there's a lot going on it. I'm more optimistic on the software because I come from the software side of the house and seeing some of the control that's coming. And I think there's nice and good things to come. Standards are always a plus in my experience. Peter, I want to thank you so much for coming on the program today. It's been a pleasure having you as a guest on Insider's Guide.
Thank you, Chris. It's been a pleasure to have the conversation with you.
For our audience, help keep the conversation going. Add comments, ask questions in the threads on our YouTube or where you subscribe for your podcast or on LinkedIn. And we will see you again next time on the Insider's Guide to Energy. Bye for now.